I now call to order the special meeting of the Belvedere Planning Commission. Can I get a roll call?
Yes, good afternoon. Commissioner Carapiet,
Here.
Commissioner Johnson,
Here.
Commissioner Seidel,
Here.
and we have Commissioner Burke on Zoom.
Here.
Thank you. Myself, Rebecca Markwick, consultants from Diet and Batia, Andrew Hill and Allison Moore. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on to the open forum. The open forum is an opportunity for any citizen to briefly address the Planning Commission on any matter that does not appear on the agenda. Comments are limited to no more than 3 minutes. Matters that appear to warrant commission consideration may be agendized for further discussion at a later meeting. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to speak during open forum? Okay, is there anyone on Zoom?
I see no one with their hands raised.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to reports. Are there any commissioners who wish to provide a report on any standing committees? Okay. Does staff have any reports?
None.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to the public hearing. I'd like to open the public hearing for the revised housing element and ask for a staff report.
Thank you. Tonight or this afternoon, we have Andrew Hill and Allison Moore from Diet and Batia, who have been working as our consultants on the housing element, and Andrew Hill will be making a presentation tonight.
Yeah, thank you, commissioners. Next slide, please. So in January of this year, the city revised the housing element and adopted it, submitting it to the state for a mandatory review. At the end of March, the California Department of Housing and Community Development returned a letter to the city requesting some additional refinements to the element for compliance with state law. And so over the past several months, we've been working. We've held a series of meetings with staff from HCD to review and vet revisions. And when we last met with HCD staff on Monday, they confirmed that these revisions are on the right track, and HCD has encouraged the city to resubmit the element for formal review. So next slide, please. So the objectives of our meeting this afternoon are to provide an overview of the changes that have been made since you've last seen the document, and if appropriate, to receive a recommendation that the element be formally resubmitted to HCD to start their review process. So formal adoption of the element will happen in the new year after the state has completed their review and they've indicated they're willing to certify. The meeting tonight is to provide an overview of the changes since you've last seen the document and receive approval to resubmit to the state. Next slide, please. So in the presentation this afternoon, what I'd like to do is just provide a quick recap of some of the requirements for the housing element, and then walk you through the revisions that have been made since the last time you saw the document. So next slide, please. Yeah, and then the next slide. I think everyone's familiar at this point, but there's several key components of the housing element. First and foremost among these is the inventory of sites that are available for housing. That's typically shown on a map and accompanied with a table with site-by-site projections for the realistic capacity of those sites. Additionally, there's requirements that the city complete some background analysis, including a review of housing needs based on census data, constraints, which include regulatory process, market-based or environmental constraints that could impede housing construction, and then also an assessment of fair housing conditions, meaning fair access to housing opportunity for all groups, including seniors or the disabled or low-income families, households. And then finally, the third real component of the housing element is a program of implementing actions that seek to facilitate the production of housing and address any identified housing needs, constraints or fair housing issues. Next slide, please. For the current planning period, which runs through 2031, Belvedere's assessed share of the regional housing need is a total of 160 units, and that's broken down into the various income categories that you can see here. Next slide, please. And so now let me walk you through some of the revisions that have been made to address HCD's comment letter of March of this year. Next slide. In summary, HCD asked for the revisions that are shown on this slide. Some of the revisions were relatively easy to address, relatively straightforward. For example, they asked for more detail about the city's progress towards implementing programs that were in the fifth cycle element, the prior element, and they asked for more data on special needs groups in Belvedere, so those were relatively simple to address. They also requested some more analysis around governmental constraints, in particular, things related to permit processing times and compliance with state law for items such as emergency shelters. So those were addressed in the constraints analysis. The biggest lift really had to do with revisions to the sites inventory that's contained in Appendix A. And specifically, they requested clarification of the ADU projection methodology that was used. They requested a discussion of the viability of non-vacant sites for redevelopment over the 8-year planning period. They asked for substantiation of the realistic capacity projections. They wanted a discussion of requirements for sites that are being rezoned to accommodate a shortfall of lower income RHNA. And they wanted some more, and it's additional assessment of fair housing patterns in relation to the sites that were identified. And so I'm going to focus really in particular on the inventory revisions, because that's really the heart of the comments that need to be addressed. In particular, one thing that HCD requested was a clarification about what is possible under current zoning and which sites are being identified to accommodate a shortfall of that lower income RHNA. And this is because there are very specific requirements that apply to sites that are identified to accommodate that lower income RHNA shortfall, and they're shown here on the screen. They include those sites must permit multifamily development by right, subject to objective standards. Each site must allow for at least 16 units per site at a density of 20 dwelling units per acre. The zoning for those sites must permit 100% residential projects. Mixed-use projects are possible, but in the event of a mixed-use project, the zoning needs to require that at least 50% of the floor area be for residential uses. So this is a particular challenge for Belvedere because there are so few sites that meet the size requirements and so few sites that are located in areas that are really appropriate for high-density housing. And so that was one thing that took a great deal of focus and effort. Next slide, please. At the end of the day, really, there's only a limited, next slide, yeah. At the end of the day, there's really only a limited universe of sites in Belvedere from which can potentially accommodate housing. And so the revised inventory in your packet clarifies which sites meet the legal requirements for ones that are identified to accommodate a shortfall of lower income RHNA. And it replaces the SB 10 overlay strategy that's in the current adopted element with SB 9 incentives. Additionally, in conversations with HCD, we were able to get them to agree to projecting 4 accessory dwelling units or junior accessory dwelling units per year over the period for a total of 32 units. In their letter of March of this year, they'd wanted a lower number than that. So I'll walk you through these changes in more detail now. Next slide, please. Let's start with a snapshot of what's possible under current zoning. Next slide. So under current zoning, this table shows that there's a possibility for 65 units in total. And so this accounts for recently approved projects that are expected to be constructed during the planning period. It also includes pending applications, and it assumes that vacant sites with residential zoning will be developed during the period. And then we also have accounted for those 32 accessory dwelling units over the period. That's 4 per year, as I mentioned. So when you add all that up, as you can see, it's 65 units total under current zoning, which is about 95 units short of the RENA requirement. And notably, there's a deficit of about 54 units on sites that have zoning at higher density, which is what the state deems affordable to lower income households. So next slide, please. So to accommodate that low and very low shortfall, go ahead, next slide, please. There are certain sites need to be rezoned in order to meet the requirements that are established in state law. And so, for example, at the boardwalk, there are 2 sites that meet the size requirements established in state law. Back in January, the city adopted zoning amendments to create a new mixed-use district, and that zoning district has sufficient density to meet the standards. And so we're projecting 61 lower income units at the boardwalk on these 2 sites, and we're counting those towards low and very low. Additionally, there's 4 units that are projected to meet the moderate income requirement. Some additional amendments to the mixed use district will be needed to make sure that all of the requirements in state law are satisfied. Those can be text amendments to permit 100% residential projects in the mixed use district, and also to require that in the event of a mixed use project, at least 50% of the floor area be for residential uses. The other sites that are in the mixed use district, there's 5 in total, so 3 others in addition to the 2 that are at the Boardwalk Shopping Center per se. Those ones are too small to be counted towards low and very low. But there is some potential for housing on those sites. And so the projected housing on those other sites has been counted towards above moderate RENA. Next slide, please. Additionally, as we've discussed before, there are 3 adjacent R3 parcels that are under common ownership. When you count them together like that, they're also of sufficient size to meet the requirements in state law for sites that are identified to accommodate a shortfall of lower income RENA. The current adopted element includes some incentives to encourage redevelopment at those sites, and including providing 2 feet of bonus height fronting Beach Road and reduced open space requirements. Those incentives are available in exchange for a commitment from the owner for affordability. And with those incentives, these sites can accommodate a total of 14 new units. Here again, some zoning amendments would be needed to establish a minimum density in the R3 zone of 20 dwelling units per acre, which is required for sites identified to accommodate that lower income shortfall. Next slide, please. And so with these zoning amendments, the inventory now has a capacity for 152 units, and that's enough to meet the requirements for low and very low income RENA. And I wanted to point out that at the boardwalk, the assumptions that we've made match what Tiburon did in their housing element. The idea is that that whole site, part of which is in Tiburon and part of which is in Belvedere, would be developed together. And so our assumptions are consistent with what Tiburon has done. However, even after these zoning amendments, there's still a deficit of moderate income units and a deficit of above moderate income units. Additionally, we need to have a buffer of sites at all income levels to make sure that the city can navigate the no net loss provisions of state law if some of the sites don't develop as envisioned in the future. Next slide, please. So in order to bridge that gap and to provide adequate buffer, we've used SB 9 incentives. Now, SB 9 is a new state law that allows qualifying property owners to split their single family lots and build up to 4 new homes on what was previously 1 single family lot. The graphic at the right here shows some of the possibilities. So it's possible under SB 9 for a property owner to split their lot and add 2 new single family homes to a new lot and add 1 new home beside the existing unit for a total of 4 over that. It's not a requirement that up to 4 units be built, so a property owner could also split the lot and build 1 new home on it if they wanted. The important point that is under SB 9 as enacted by the state, you cannot have more than 4 units on what was previously one single family lot. And also, Belvedere's current SB 9 ordinance is very clear that you cannot build an ADU on a new lot if you have already built a 2-unit house home, on that newly created lot. So Belvedere does have an SB 9 ordinance, and the city has seen some interest from property owners. 2 SB 9 lot splits have been approved to date, and there's another pending SB 9 lot split. Also, other Marin County communities have seen interest, in particular, Corte Madera, Ross, and unincorporated Marin County have all seen activity in the SB 9 field. So there is potential here to use this as a strategy for bridging the RHNA deficit and building buffer. Next slide, please. And so the idea is that Belvedere would amend its existing ordinance to go beyond the basic requirements of state law and provide bonus units in exchange for a commitment to affordability from the owner. So for example, with these revisions to the SB 9 ordinance, if a homeowner commits to deed restricting one of the new units for moderate income households, then they would get the right to 1 bonus unit. So that means a total of 5 units over what is currently 1 single family lot. And some of the possibilities are shown in the graphic at right there. Also, and that would help to bridge that gap of moderate income units that I mentioned. And then additionally, if the owner were to commit to making one of the new units affordable to lower income households, then they would get the right to 2 bonus units. And some of the permutations and combinations are shown in that screen. Again, in no case under these revisions would the homeowner have the right to more than 3 units per lot, or a total of 6 units over what was formerly 1 lot if they make a commitment to deed restricting one of the new units for lower income households. Next slide, please. And so in Belvedere, there's over 350 lots that theoretically qualify for SB 9. Additionally, HCD wanted to see some analysis to demonstrate the viability of sites in Belvedere to support our SB 9 projections. And so we did some analysis to identify the most likely candidates. There's 32 candidates that were identified. This doesn't mean that housing is projected necessarily on those sites. The purpose of this analysis was merely to demonstrate to HCD that there are viable sites in Belvedere. To do that, we looked at the characteristics of those sites and we compared them to other sites in other Marin County communities that have seen SB 9 lot splits and housing development to demonstrate that the characteristics of those sites were comparable and that the zoning in place was comparable as well. And so on that basis, next slide, please, we've projected a total of 36 SB 9 units over the 8-year planning period. And we're projecting that 3 of them would be deed restricted for low and very low, 6 would be for moderate, and the remainder 27 would be for above moderate housing. And in addition, this SB 9 program would also help the city meet its requirements for what HCD calls housing mobility. This is the idea that the city needs to promote a wider variety of housing types in what are predominantly single-family neighborhoods in order to provide opportunities for marginalized and disadvantaged residents in the city. And so because the SB 9 potential, as you saw on the map on the previous slide, is predominantly on the island, this helps not only bridge that gap of moderate income, build the buffer, but also satisfies those requirements for housing mobility. So next slide. So that's a lot, and I'm happy to take any questions when we make it through the presentation. But as I say, the largest number of revisions and the biggest changes are in that inventory. So I wanted to spend time on that for you. Additionally, there are some other changes to some key programs in the Housing Action Plan, and I'll walk through those now. Program 1A in the element called for a citywide inclusionary requirement. That was ultimately not adopted in January of this year. and because there was some discussion with property owners about how that might be a constraint on development, particularly in the R3 area. However, Tiburon does have an inclusionary requirement which would apply to the boardwalk. And so the strategy with this program here is to change the focus of it and to instead have an inclusionary requirement that matches what Tiburon does, that would be applicable only in the mixed use district. And then secondarily, the city would consider the feasibility of adopting an in lieu fee at a later date, perhaps by the end of 2026. Next slide, please. Program 2A has to do with objective design and development standards. In their letter of March, HCD had requested clarification as to when Title 22, the city's adopted odds applies, and also that there is a non-discretionary procedure for review and approval of multifamily housing in Belvedere. The mixed use district clearly establishes this. Program 2 then clarifies that Title 22 will apply to all multifamily housing projects outside of the mixed use district, because the mixed use district already has objective standards that apply. And then through this program, Title 2, it would also be clarified that it would apply to single family developments or multifamily developments that choose to have a discretionary review process. Next slide. And then additionally, there's a program 1H, which originally called for in lieu fees from inclusionary housing to go into a housing development fund. Ultimately, the in lieu fees generated in Belvedere would not likely support much, if any, new development, given the cost of development. And so this program has been reframed to expand potential uses for the fund. So for example, funds generated by an in lieu fee could be used to defer the cost of any waivers or discounts that the city might offer for affordable housing development, to meet any local match requirements that are often required for grant funding for affordable housing, or to fund the maintenance or rehabilitation of existing deed restricted units in the city, such as at Farley Place. And so finally, a look ahead to next steps. As I mentioned in our meetings with HCD staff, they've confirmed that these revisions are on the right path, and they've encouraged the city to resubmit for a formal review. And so happy to answer any of your questions tonight, take any of your comments, and hopefully we can come away with a recommendation to take to the city council that these revisions be formally resubmitted to HCD. There's a meeting with the city council scheduled for the 12th of November, and within short order, assuming that the city council approves resubmittal, we would then resubmit to HCD. Under state law, they would have 60 days to complete their review. At the end of that period, we would expect them to submit a letter that says the city, if the city adopts with these revisions, then they can find the element in substantial compliance. And so after receipt of that letter, after we get confirmation from HCD that the element is in substantial compliance, then we would bring it back first to the Planning Commission and ultimately to the City Council for adoption. So anticipated in February of next year. So that's the end of my presentation, but I'm happy to take any questions or comments that you might have.
Great, thank you so much. Are there any questions for staff or our consultants from the commission?
I have some. So first one I want to talk about is 2A. So 2A, in your presentation, it said Title 20 would apply if an applicant chose not to go through discretionary review. That's not what 2A says.
I think the slide says if the applicant opted for discretionary review.
Correct. The slide does say that. What's written in the housing element does not say that. It says all multifamily housing outside of the MU zone will go through Title 22. So it may just need that program needs to be just re-reviewed.
Yes, we can certainly take a look at the language. I think the intent was to as required under state law, to make sure that there is a clear non-discretionary path for multifamily housing, which is what HCD had requested. But at the same time, also to allow, if ever there was a property owner that wanted to go through a discretionary review, that avenue would also be provided.
So in our Title 22 is for SB 330 and 35 applications. So are you saying that everyone, if someone wanted to bring in a discretionary review, but didn't file they would have to file an SB 330 application? Is that correct?
They would have to file it in order to get the non-discretionary path.
So, and the non-discretionary path is the process that our odds goes through in SB 330. I don't know about 35, but SB 330 I'm familiar with enough to say, and that requires or allows for up to 5 public hearing meetings. So your non-discretionary review is not a ministerially review where it's just the checklist, like an ADU, where they do their checklist, and if it fits all the requirements, they just get it, and there's no noticing and no anything to the surrounding neighbors.
Yeah, so I guess the wrinkle here is that on any of the sites that are identified to accommodate a shortfall of lower income RHNA, so now I'm talking about the 2 R3 clusters and the 2 sites at the boardwalk, because those are being identified to accommodate the lower income shortfall, they must be provided that non-discretionary path. So they would have the ministerial process that you're talking about.
They would, so the clusters,
Yes.
and of course, CMU is handled by 19.41. It's not going to be in odds anymore.
Right.
So, so the next question is that in the R3 zone, a single family home is allowed. We have no single family home odds. This is also a question that's going to come up for the 2E program for SB 9, that we have no objective standards for single family homes. So it's something we need to develop. So projecting out, on January 13th, we get a package from HCD that says we're all good to go. And we don't have our odds in line or in shape for SB 9. When does that SB 9 and the ministerial for the cluster come into effect if we have no standards? We're back to a prior project situation.
So assuming the commission, okays the SB 9 strategy today, we would start to prepare the zoning to implement that strategy, and it would come back to first the commission and then the council for adoption together with the
zoning changes.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I just jump on this
Sure.
topic? Because I have a couple on this one too. So I just want to make sure I'm following. So all multifamily developments outside the MU zone are subject to odds regardless of the affordability component.
Correct.
Okay. And SB 9 would be subject to odds as well. Or we have to develop, to your point, we have to develop a separate standard.
Yes.
For
the
SB9s.
SB 9, the revised SB 9 ordinance would contain the standards that
Separate
apply.
standards.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it would be like an ADU.
Right.
That it's just staff approval.
And then again, just for my own, so odds being a different process than the non-discretionary review. 2 separate things. Okay.
Odds being separate from the discretionary, the optional discretionary review.
Well, yeah, that I'm clear about, but
Okay.
we're referring to odds and we're referring to non-discretionary review. Are you meaning those to be the same thing?
No.
Or are you talking about 2 separate things?
Non-discretionary is ministerial, meaning odds, right? Odds has a set of development standards that are objective. And so when we think of discretionary review, we think of a planning commission hearing and public notice.
Right, but there's still procedural things that have to happen, even if we have objective standards in place.
Right.
Right,
Which
so
would
like
be-
to the 5 meetings, okay. So
But
that's
that's
still
if they apply for an SB 330 or 35 application.
only.
Right.
So let me,
Okay.
I went down the rabbit hole too. So, yeah, I know, it's a big rabbit hole. So if somebody comes in with SB 330, they get up to 5 public meetings.
Okay,
If they come in on the cluster, which is the R3 on Beach, the properties that are zoned, are in the cluster on Beach, they would have ministerial review. So it would be reviewed like an ADU. They come in
Okay.
with their application, they have to meet whatever we create, setbacks and all that.
Okay.
And that they would have to meet that, but there would be no
planning.
planning, no public hearing, and probably no story polls. We might as well get that out.
Right. And that's why those odds are sort of more developed, right? They have window types, they have porch
Mhm,
types, they have open space requirements. So you try to capture possibly what you would capture at a planning commission hearing in those objective standards.
Yeah, okay. And so the parking, one of my questions has to do with the SB9 parking requirements. That would be included when those standards are developed for SB9s. Okay, thank you.
Can I just add to this because since we're on this topic, is so then what would have to go or would be required to go through discretionary review
For
What-
multifamily,
for multifamily? Yeah, what if
nothing
any?
would be, nothing
Right.
would be required, but there would be an optional path. If there was ever a property owner that wanted to go through a discretionary process, they would have that option.
Would be highly unusual. So, I mean, what this is essentially saying is that on a going forward basis, assuming this is passed and we update the odds to include SB9, multifamily there would be no multifamily that would be required to go through discretionary review or Title 20.
Required, correct?
But they could opt to, because we've had 2 applicants already opt into regular review. Okay. I'm trying to separate my questions from my comments. SB9, so the SB9 incentives are citywide.
Yes, that
Okay.
is correct. I mean, to be clear, not every site in Belvedere, not every single family zone parcel qualifies for SB9. I think we did an analysis of about 368 that theoretically qualify for SB9.
Okay, and there is no size requirement, lot size requirement,
There is a lot size requirement.
1,200.
Right, in state law, no newly created lot under SB9 can be less than 1,200 square feet. So 2,400, the original lot has to be at least 2,400 square feet.
So then I guess my other question is going to be when you bring back the zoning changes with what the SB9 development is supposed to look like. I know you have in there that you want to clarify that if they meet all the setbacks that they can have more than 800 square feet. And it's at that time we could decide what kind of square footage would be allowed.
Yes, provided there's certain stipulations in state law about,
Right.
But yes, within those bounds, yes.
Okay. All right, that answered that question. Oh, on the clusters, you have that we're going to be changing the density from 5 to 20 to 25 to 20 or 28, or is it just 20 or 28?
So because those clusters are sites that are identified to accommodate that lower income shortfall, there's those requirements in state law that apply. And the minimum density needs to be 20 dwelling units per acre. So that, and it's not there now, so the minimum needs to be established at 20. We did some site testing to figure out what density would need to get to the number of units that Belvedere Land Company had indicated they would like to add onto those properties. And the maximum is they would need about 26.5 dwelling units per acre to get what they wanted. So we established a ceiling at 28. dwelling units per acre. So the range proposed would be from 20 to 28 dwelling units per acre. And the reason we didn't establish the ceiling at 26.5 is because HCD will want to see a little buffer between.
They like buffers.
Yeah.
So I had a few more. It was, can you explain program 2F? It's something that's been there, it hasn't changed, but it's something that caught my eye, that program 2F is co-housing overlay. Could you explain where that would take place?
So that program would involve, first of all, the city creating an ordinance, and through the process of creating it, you would establish the parameters for where it would apply. The intent of the program is to help satisfy those requirements for what the state calls housing mobility, essentially expanding the range of housing types in established single-family neighborhoods. So I would assume it would apply on larger sites on the island, for example. But you would have the latitude to help define where that would apply.
So the assembly bill that did this overlay said that it was in effect for cities with over 400,000 population. I think it's 682 maybe, or AB 680.
This co-housing overlay isn't linked to any requirement in state law. It's something that would be at the discretion of Belvedere to develop. So you would have the latitude to develop the parameters that you wanted around it. But the objective is articulated in the program, and it's the purpose is trying to meet those requirements for housing mobility and expand the range of housing types in established single-family neighborhoods.
Okay, but it's not required by ACD, right? Okay.
Well, they did ask for programs that address housing mobility. They didn't say you need this one.
Okay.
No.
And then you use this term universal design, and I think you probably have answered this before, but I can't remember what the answer is. What do you mean by universal design?
It's an established set of criteria, and maybe one of the architects might be able to handle this better than me, but I believe it has to do with disability access.
Okay. Those are my questions.
Thank you. Kevin or Alex, do you have any questions?
Sure, I have a few. So I'm on the housing element. I'm on page 312, and this is related to what we were just discussing. In terms of the development of design standards for SB 9, so the path that will go on is that would be theoretically ready in January?
Well, yes, for hearings in February. So the idea is that HCD's review ends on January 13th, and the next planning commission hearing would be in February. But the intent would be to do a study session with the planning commission to this is essentially a soft look at the ordinance before we bring it forward for adoption. And so a study session could conceivably be in January, I would think, yes.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, because my concern or my desire would be to ensure that we give the community plenty of time to get comfortable with this and have the opportunity to weigh in, because this is certainly going to be very new for folks, especially if we're adding incentives that would allow people to build up to, to move from what was 1 unit to 6 units on a parcel. I mean, that's quite a change for neighbors. So I think those standards are going to be very important. And this is just minor, and I only have a few of these, so I'm not going to, bore you with typos, but there's right above it, there's 2 additional. You just need to delete that one. If you go to page 4-3, program 1A, let me scroll to that myself. It would be helpful to me if you could explain the bullet. It's the second bullet under program requirements and timeframe by the end of Q4 2026. There's a lot here, and to be honest, I got confused by it, and it would be helpful to hear you.
Sure.
define it for me.
So the first bullet, A and B, both are matching what's in Tiburon's inclusionary ordinance and what would apply at the boardwalk. And it's a little complicated, and so that's why it's kind of bulleted out there. But essentially, Tiburon says projects proposing 7 or more units need to make at least 15% of those units affordable to moderate income households. And of that 15%, 5% needs to be for lower income households, so making less than 80%. And then if a project, Tiburon's ordinance also said a project with more than 12 units has different requirements. And in that case, 20% of the units would need to be for moderate. And of that 20%, at least 5 needs to be for lower income. And so we're just matching the requirements of Tiburon.
Of Tiburon. Yeah, I was clear on that. I'm sorry, maybe I wasn't clear on the question. It's below that, the feasibility of adopting an in lieu fee for projects and then going on to talk about the fee nexus study. Yeah, sure. No issues. Just if you could just explain that, that would be helpful.
Right. So these requirements would require that the property owner build inclusionary units, right? Moderate or lower income, as according to the standards. These you don't need any sort of nexus study to adopt a requirement that they build. However, if you wanted to provide an option for a project, a smaller project, for example, that may be financially challenged to meet the inclusionary requirements, if you wanted to provide an option for that type of project to pay a fee instead of building the units, then you need to do what's called a nexus study to establish a fair fee. And that takes a little bit more time and involves complexity. And so this bullet is saying, this program is saying, as a first step, adopt those requirements that would apply to the boardwalk and anything in the mixed use district, that property owners there develop inclusionary units, period. And then this other bullet is saying, as a longer term project, by the end of, say, 2026, complete a study and assess whether it's feasible, and if so, what the in lieu fee would be, and then at that point adopt it.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Kevin, just before we move on from that topic, I had a couple questions about that also.
Please.
So just clarifying, impact fees would only be collected if there's no affordable units in the development. And then I was under the impression that impact fees had to be used for like public infrastructure and services. But then there's a reference to using them to establish a housing development fund, which would then go to support affordable and workforce housing. So is that allowed? Are there certain regulations and requirements around how that money is used and spent?
Yes, and that is probably a better question for the city attorney to answer, who's unfortunately not here. But what I can say is that the housing fund, the intent of that would be any monies collected in that would be used to support affordable housing. It might not necessarily mean development, but to the extent that the city might offer a fee waiver or a discount to another project that proposes affordable housing, money in that fund could be used to offset that, so long as the ultimate goal is supporting the development of affordable housing in Belvedere.
Okay, so thank you. But maybe a question for the attorney.
I can follow up with
Okay,
Anne.
perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Kevin. Sorry.
Sure, no worries. Moving on to page 4-7, program IF. I had a question around the 3 bullets. The first 2 seem, well, I guess I wonder, are these purposely vague or should we be including the specifics here? So increasing the maximum allowable size of ADUs permitted by right, I mean, should we be putting that in?
I think the intent was to provide sort of parameters for this, this effort, but not necessarily to paint yourselves into a corner at this stage. And so the way it's written allows the commission and ultimately the council the parameters to decide what the appropriate additional size would be. And perhaps, through community outreach and discussions with property owners.
Okay. So it is, I mean, it's on purpose to give us the
Yes,
flexibility.
yes.
That makes sense. And then the last bullet, offering a transferable FAR bonus. What is a transferable FAR bonus?
To the primary dwelling unit.
Got it. Okay. And that is like the 2 bullet points before left open-ended at this point.
Yes.
Great. If you go down to the bottom.
Kevin, I just have one
yeah,
question, but on that
please.
FAR. So is it not that the transferable FAR is for existing space that they developed into an ADU or a JADU, that space, like if somebody did a JADU and it was 300 square feet, that's existing in the structure of the house, they would be able to transfer that square footage to be built on another little 300 square foot little addition to whatever.
I think it could be the way this program is written, and as Kevin points out, it is intentionally vague. It says it could include things such as these 3 bullets, and the intent is to give the city the discretion to determine specifically what bonuses would be granted. But this is putting a variety of cards on the table, and I think the idea behind this is as an incentive. If somebody wanted to. Maybe they were maxed out on FAR, but they wanted to do to build an ADU and deed restricted for lower income households, then maybe as an incentive for doing that, they might be given bonus FAR that could be transferred to the primary dwelling unit. Again, this program doesn't say that is exactly what is going to be done. That just puts it as one potential option to consider.
So this again is another program that has to be developed.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And then just as long as we're on program 1F, and I'll add 1D, and that's probably more of a comment, but we're here, is that these zoning incentives are for low income deed restriction. And it's not in here that it's low income deed restriction. It just says deed restricted. The title doesn't even say zoning incentives for deed restricted low income. So
it does
on
say-
both 1D and 1F.
Okay, it does say, and what it says in 1D, incomes less than 80% of the Marin County annual median through a recorded deed. So that's what it's getting at.
I know, but we had that situation where we forgot those 2 words. And I
Okay.
think those 2 words are important so that we're not confused that it's just a deed
Okay.
restriction.
Yep. And so that was 1D and 1F, right?
1F.
Yeah.
So should I continue? Moving
Yeah.
on? Okay,
Mhm.
so if you go down to 4.8, and it's the second bullet point, or actually, I'm sorry, it's the first bullet point on that page. This is related to SB9s. I just want to clarify this. I think you made this clear in your opening presentation, but I want to be sure, is that to get to 6 units, you only need to commit to 1 unit to be low income. So it isn't to 5 requires 1 for moderate, and then to get to 6, you have to then add another. So do you know what I'm saying? So 2 of the
Yes.
6 wouldn't be moderate or low.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
To get to 6, it's 1 lower income.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And-
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So on the last bullet point in that section, it talks about the performance of this SB9 incentive. So, and it says that if we're not getting our SB9s, that we reevaluate.
Mhm.
So what happens if we're making our numbers where we need them and how we need them through ADUs?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. If you are on track overall, not necessarily just through this program, but on track overall, then there's no risk of no net loss. There's no risk of you, or doesn't appear to be substantial risk of you missing your targets, and corrective action would not be needed.
So can we add something that says it's necessary for arena numbers, just so that
Uh-huh.
It's a holistic
we
view. I
don't,
had the same
yeah, I
question.
mean, we don't have our SB9 numbers, but we have all the rest of the
Yeah,
numbers going
yeah.
along, so.
Yep.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Thank you. If you go to 410, this was a question just in the heading here, it specifies extremely low income households and special
Mhm.
need groups. But then if you go into the body of the content below, it actually includes all different types of categories of income households. And so I didn't know if this was purposely meant to be just for extremely low income households or broader, as would is suggested by the content.
Yeah, it's meant to be broader. And so special needs encompasses lower income households, not just extremely low or very low. So this is HCD is particularly looking for a program specifically that targets extremely low income households and also special needs. And special needs is a broad category that includes other income demographics.
Does that include seniors?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
And the disabled and female-headed households, and there's about 7 different categories.
Okay, so you don't think, I mean, the way it's written is not misleading. You think they would understand it, or it encompasses all of those different categories?
Yes, and they've reviewed it and they have not commented or asked for any changes related to this
Okay,
one.
cool. Moving on to 415. I think we may have already addressed this. Yeah, we already addressed this with other comments from other commissioners. If you go to 417. Oh, this is just very minor. At the very end, just before quantified objectives, the previous sentence, complete all over needed changes, is just, I think that over should be deleted.
Oh, I see.
Go to 418. Let me see what my question was here. Could you just make sure, just explain they require that at least 50% of the floor area in a mixed use project be devoted to residential use? Is that common use? So that is 1, 2, 3, well, it's a couple bullets down from program requirements and time frame.
Yeah, I think it's the total, the gross floor area of the project. 50% of it needs to be for residential uses.
Residential use versus commercial or other.
Yes.
Got it. And then just below that, and this might be the same answer that you gave me before in terms of giving ourselves flexibility, these seem rather vague. Meet regularly with property owners, work with the property owner, identify actions such as, again, I'm just wondering whether or not we need to be more specific, or if you're comfortable with them continuing to be more open-ended or vague.
I think, yeah, again, yeah, it's trying not to paint anyone into a corner to allow for flexibility. If you have some ideas and you thought you wanted to put some more specifics in there, we could add such as or may include. If you feel that's helpful.
If you don't think it's necessary, we shouldn't add it.
I don't think so.
And then on the last point under quantifiable objectives, the 65, 61 of them being affordable. I mean, the math and the analysis we did to get comfortable with that, can you just remind me how you arrived at that number?
Yeah, it's we're
I mean,
mirroring.
it's very ambitious.
It's very ambitious, which is why the buffer becomes very important. But it's simply matching the math in Tiburon certified housing element. I think this site is challenging because it's half in Tiburon and half in Belvedere, and Tiburon has already committed and has a certified element. So I think Belvedere is just trying to match what's there. Tiburon has some pretty aggressive affordability assumptions for it's the same development, right, that would be happening just partially in both communities. And so we've just simply matched the assumptions there.
Okay. 4-20, I was just curious, we deleted 2 programs. So there was 2-G, SB10. Oh, I know why we did a little of that. And then what about religious institutions? Same thing?
Yes, also there's been a change in circumstances. The church across the street here has been
Became a
sold
single.
and there's an active development application there. So it's no longer available for higher density, housing as originally envisioned.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yep, I'm clear. 4-20 under program requirements and timeframe. This is program 2-F. Amend zoning ordinance to permit co-housing on lots larger than 0.5 acres or more. Would this be in any zone?
Is this program 2D you're talking about?
It's 2-F, co-housing overlay. On
F, sorry.
page, yeah, no worries, on page 4-22.
That's the one I asked.
About the co-housing? And
I'm sorry, Pat, was that the same question you were asking?
Yeah, my microphone wasn't on, sorry. That's the same question I asked. It would be a program we'd have to develop, and it most likely would be in overlay in the single family dwelling.
So only for single family is what you're thinking.
Well, that's
and-
not what I'm thinking, but that's what Andrew's thinking.
it's one of these housing mobility programs. And so it would probably target, for example, established single family neighborhoods. So probably on the island.
Got it. 4-24, first paragraph, we're talking about the process. The review process, the city will identify internal process improvements and reduce the time required for review and approval. I mean, here again, this seems vague, but I mean, versus what we had provided before. But I'm assuming, I mean, this is, the thought is that this is better to leave it more open-ended.
Yes.
Okay. And then under quantifiable objectives, reduce permit processing times. I mean, that's really not quantifiable, but you think that's okay? I mean, quantifiable should have a number in it.
Right. It should. I mean, I'm inclined to resubmit this and see what HCD says. It would
Okay.
be, it would be a relatively simple modification if they wanted a, I don't know, percentage reduction, for example.
Got it. Last is 438. Let me just get to that so I can see what I was asking here. And this one, I'm sorry if you've already covered this, is we're deleting funding for workforce housing. I'm just curious why.
Yes, it's being combined with program, is it 1G, the housing fund? I guess in the adopted element, there's sort of two programs that are overlapping. One was the housing development fund, and one is this funding for workforce housing. They're overlapping and sort of duplicative. And so what we've done is to consolidate them into one housing fund.
Got it. And
Can I ask a quick question about that? Is that managed by the city or is that managed by the county?
It would be managed by the city. It would be the city's
Yeah,
fund.
okay.
I'm now on Appendix A, but many, or at least so far, my questions have been answered. Let me just scroll through to see if there's
Can I just
anything.
pipe up while you're scrolling through, Kevin?
Yeah, please.
Just to circle back to the SB9 changes, just for clarification, currently under SB9, you can have up to 4 units. I'm not sure if,
Yeah.
right? So the 2 additional units are incentives for affordability, right? So it would be 1 moderate and 1 low to get those 6 units. But right now, anybody in SB9 can have 4.
Can get 4.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
I got that. Thank you.
But no, Rebecca, they don't do 1 moderate and 1 low. If they do 1 low, they get a bonus regular, yeah.
One moderate gets them to 5, 1 low gets them to 6.
Correct.
Yeah. On A-23, this was a question, it's the review of 874 single family zone parcels of Belvedere. There were 368 of sufficient size and located outside of areas of environmental hazard. What are areas that were considered environmentally hazardous?
Yeah. So there's the SB9 identifies certain specific hazards. And so,
Oh, so
you
it's
know, fault
specific to that.
zones and it's
Yeah.
exactly.
And A20, 831. And then on A53, which is the site inventory, I guess the question for you would be, how comfortable do we feel with the buffer? I think we're at 118%, is that right?
Yeah, the state recommends a buffer. I mean, there's no requirement for a buffer. They do require that you have a buffer. They don't stipulate what that buffer must be, but state recommends between 15 and 30% buffer. But you know, 10% is also standard. A lot of communities 10%, and HCD has even certified elements with lower buffers than that.
So I'm hearing you're very comfortable. That's a joke. And I think that's it. I had a couple things on C, but let me, I'll yield to whoever else wants to ask questions and see if those might have already gotten answered through the other questions or other commissioners.
I had one more question on 2E. So you have certain sites as potential SB9 sites. Those sites that you have identified are not the same as identifying like the cluster. Correct.
Correct. Those, and I
So
tried.
those homeowners aren't going to be bound to have to.
Absolutely
okay.
not. And I tried to make that clear in the presentation, but just for to be crystal clear, those sites are not on the inventory, right? The analysis was done at the request of HCD to demonstrate that there are viable sites. And so we're not, in fact, there's 368 sites that are theoretically eligible, right? So that this SB9 housing could happen on any of those 368 sites subject to owner interest, right? But what we're trying to do to get HCD to agree with our 36 SB9 units is to demonstrate, look, there's these 32 sites that are strong candidates, and they're strong candidates because they have the same characteristics as sites that have, you know, already had lot splits in other Marin County communities, and they have comparable zoning, and so it's that all that analysis is purely for the purpose of demonstrating the viability, but it doesn't put any onus or requirement on property owners at all.
I have a sort of follow-up question to that. So we've identified a lot of sites here, and if these are not developed at the intensity that we've indicated, are there repercussions for the city?
For SB9 in particular, or for?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
What
So-
matters at the end, sorry, just to clarify, what
Yeah.
matters at the end of the
We meet
day
our goals.
is the total number of units permitted, right? The construction permits.
Okay. And if we're not on pace to meet that number?
So I think at midpoint in the 8-year cycle, HCD will likely do a statewide evaluation like they did in the past cycle. And you know, they'll do an assessment of which communities are on track and which are not. And they may, you know, as they did with SB 35, there may be, you know, new requirements around that. All the programs also commit the city, particularly around ADUs and around SB9 at the request of HCD. We've put in a self-assessment to make sure that we're on track. But as Pat pointed out, that assessment is not specifically limited to ADUs or to SB9 units. It's holistically, is the city on track to meet its RHNA? You know, and what HCD has specifically requested is that the city put in multiple strategies to get to RHNA. So if any one of them is not on track, you still have other avenues to meet your RHNA. And that's what this element does through a variety of different strategies.
Okay. Thank you. Kevin, did you have any more questions?
No, I think it's maybe the last question is, I'm sure you already did this. So HCD has already reviewed this. So you've had a work session with them. So this has sort of been vetted in most respects. And so the addressing of all of the issues raised in the letter dated March 29th, 2024, they and you feel like this is doing a good job of addressing them.
Yes, and so the language that they use is this is on the right track, this is moving in the right direction.
Sure.
Because it's
They can't commit to something, right.
Exactly. They're not going to commit to anything until they actually at the end of that formal 60-day review period. But they've given us assurances that this is, you know, moving in the right direction.
Yeah. Then those are all my questions. Thank you. This is a lot of work done by you and staff and your team and, you know, the other folks on the commission who've been involved in this. It's I really appreciate how much work has been put into this and how much progress has been made. So thank you.
Alex, did you have any questions?
Yeah, I have a couple questions and just wanted to start with the SB 9, which is kind of new territory for me. You're welcome, Ken. Can you hear that?
Yes.
Okay. So the diagram that you have in the report, as I understand it, that's illustrative. At first, when I looked at it, I thought maybe those were the designated sites, but there's 368 potential sites under SB 9. Could you just summarize for me what makes those 368 eligible for SB 9?
Yeah. So they have to be of an appropriate size. And as we talked about, the minimum size is probably about 2,400 square feet because after subdivision, each lot needs to be at least 1,200 square feet. So it's size parameters. It's also being located out of hazard areas, so earthquake fault zones. Flooding or liquefaction are things that can be addressed through site design, and so those are not. If a site is in a 100-year flood zone, for example, provided the base flood elevation is satisfactorily elevated, that doesn't disqualify it, but there is a requirement that environmental constraint be addressed. Additionally, state law says that if there's a historic resource on the site, it's not eligible. So basically, it's the size parameters, it's having single-family zoning, it's being outside of environmental constraints, away from designated historic resources. And then additionally, after lot split, there's a ownership requirement. So one of the units needs to be occupied by the original property owner, and the intent of that requirement is to avoid speculation.
Okay, so following up on that, the 1,200 square foot minimum is established by the state, not by our code. So many of these lots presumably would be much smaller than what the underlying original zoning is.
Correct.
And so I'm just trying to imagine on the island, I mean, what standards would apply to the design of a unit on a very small lot in terms
Right.
of setbacks and so
So
forth?
you're reminding me that I didn't mention the access requirements. After subdivision, each of the lots needs to have adequate access.
Okay.
So I think, and there's, fire standards that would apply as well. The newly created lot needs to have access to roads that meet fire standards as well.
And that makes sense. But then what I'm trying to get at is, I don't know, on the island, if you were applying, would you apply the kind of setback rules that we have, or are they under a completely different set of requirements?
So the setbacks would be established in your SB 9 ordinance, right? The objective standards that would
Which
go into,
hasn't been written yet, I
right,
guess.
which hasn't been written. So yeah.
Okay, so that's more to come, I guess, on how that would be applied.
Correct. What HCD did say is they wanted the city, in crafting that ordinance, they wanted the city to look at other Marin County jurisdictions where SB 9 housing has been permitted or built, and make sure that your ordinance ultimately is at least as permissive as those ordinances, in order for them to sign off on the viability of approving this approach.
Okay, it's an interesting approach. Depending on how the standards are set, I could imagine differing results. So it's kind of an interesting avenue.
Yeah.
Okay, so then on the mixed use district, I'm going to try to paraphrase what I think I heard. I don't know if I'm right or not, but I think that the way the state is looking at this, the small sites don't lend themselves to the low and very low, so you're aggregating it in the mixed use district predominantly. And does that mean that most of the housing there would be income restricted?
So to be clear, right, there's 5 sites that are in Belvedere's mixed-use
Mhm.
district. And what we've said is only 2 of those sites, the 2 sites that are owned by Belvedere Land Company and make up the, the Boardwalk Shopping Center are of sufficient size to accommodate lower income RENA. And so those sites will be rezoned to meet those specific
And
standards.
those are the 2 sites I'm really interested in,
Yeah.
not the little ones. So I'm trying to visualize what's the income levels and the composition of the population in the big projects.
Right. I think ultimately that is down to, well, to a certain extent, that's down to the property owner. However, because Tiburon has put in place inclusionary requirements that Belvedere would be mirroring, the minimum amount is stipulated by that. So they're proposing to develop 65 units. And so that, you remember that we were, with Kevin, we were going through those bullets.
Mhm.
So a project of 12 or more units would be required to make 20% of the units affordable to moderate, with 5% of that 20% for. So that means 65 units at a minimum, 15% of 65 would be for moderate income and 5% of 65 would
Okay.
be for lower income. That's a minimum. That's not to say that, that the property owner might opt for density bonus or something and have to do more affordability, or they might opt to
Got
do more
it.
affordability.
Okay. That actually, that gives me some comfort, but it's, in some lines of thinking, it's not a good idea to concentrate all
Yeah,
one
yeah.
type of income in one place. But what you're describing is these would still be mixed income
Yes.
developments. So that makes sense to me. I reiterate just a comment of what Kevin said. He beat me to the punch, but this looks like a lot of work. So thank you to staff and Diet and Bettina for getting us this far along the line. It sounds like we see light at the end of the tunnel.
Thank you. So I have a couple kind of more global questions. A lot of my other questions have already been answered. Belvedere has an aging population. And I'm just curious if you have seen housing elements that further incentivize senior housing in particular. And do we feel that the housing element is adequately addressing our aging population?
I mean, I think there's always more that can be done, but in particular, we were looking at the extremely low and special needs program, which provides sort of a menu of additional incentives that could be offered on a case-by-case basis as projects come forward, because the special needs category includes seniors, older adults. All of those incentives are available there. It's a pretty comprehensive menu of options to incentivize those projects. So there's that. I think the housing fund that we mentioned, the way we've expanded the potential uses for that fund could support, rehabilitation at Farley Place, for example, or even support the grant for if somebody wanted to build a senior complex, it could be used there. So there's a number of things in this toolkit that would help.
And then my last question has to do with the initial study and the potential environmental impacts. So how would significant environmental impacts affect the housing element? And if an EIR is required and there are impacts that need to be mitigated, would those be put in place before any development occurs?
Yeah, so what we would need to do when we bring this whole package back for adoption, which will include the housing element and implementing zoning as well, we would need to prepare a CEQA document. And that, because there's already an adopted ISMND, what we would do is make sure that the changes in the housing element wouldn't result any new or substantially greater impacts than were previously identified. So there would be an environmental document to confirm that.
Okay. Okay, I think that covers all of my questions. Thank you. So are there any questions or comments from members of the public? Please. If you can come up and is the microphone on? Okay. Make sure you turn your mic on, please.
I'm green. Thanks, Rebecca. This has really been educational. We got a big problem, as Kevin has said, of educating the community as to these changes. I congratulate the consultants on really working with the city to come up with something that fits. It's not easy. It's really very difficult. I had two specific questions that came up while I was listening to the discussion, and then one comment. The first one was a comment, I forget the reference point, but was lots on the lagoon to be removed from the R2 zone. Do you remember that? Yeah. How many lots are there that are projected to be removed? Because I didn't see anything on the map.
Yeah, please.
So I think just to clarify, they're not being removed from the R2 zone. What that was meant to say was that in the current adopted version of the housing element, we had included some R2 sites on the inventory. And in this revised version, they're not included on the inventory.
So
They're not being rezoned, they're just removed from the
thank you for
inventory.
that clarification. And then am I right on a clarification also? I didn't see any lots except maybe one on the SB9 map that related to the flat area of the lagoon. And I was wondering why just one was identified at the end of Windward, I think it was.
So again, there's 368 single-family lots that are theoretically eligible. That map was just showing our 32 best candidates based on that analysis. And so the parameters that we used, were, the size of the sites, had to do with the size of the existing structure in relation to lot size.
Okay.
So it's not, it just happened that the best candidates, according to that analysis, seem to be mostly on the island. But that
Right.
doesn't mean that if there is a qualifying site somewhere else in the city, that the property owner wouldn't have the option to develop SC9 if they wanted to.
Okay, I can seek clarification on that map. But the main point I'd like to make is that there's really a lot of work to be done here to be fair to the staff and to the community and to homeowners and potential developers to establish these, I think they're called odds or for some reason, standards. Kevin mentioned it, Alex mentioned it. That's really where the guts of this is going to make or break the community in terms of the procedure, because procedure always determines outcome. And it's not fair to the staff to not have clarity. It causes angst amongst a lot of people. We had that experience here recently in Belvedere, where things are decided as being complete with not necessarily enough detail given to staff, and staff gets blamed for, things that they made a judgment on. So I hope the aftermath of this, when it goes forward, will not be forgotten. I think Alex mentioned a minute ago, Kevin earlier, being detailed as to those checkpoints is so that both the people that are trying to build and the staff can have clarity, because that's really important. So thank you very much. And the time put in is amazing, and we've had excellent people doing it. And it's nice to see that this process, I hope, is working in the right direction. When you get up to the city council, you'll have the same talent. So I look forward to that also. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have anyone else who would like to make public comment?
Yes, I have someone on Zoom, Deli Woodring. Jelly, you should be able to talk now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I have two basic questions which perhaps you've answered. I get a little bit lost in all the SB 9, 8.5 FGs, et cetera, because I'm not as familiar with all of it. But will there be parking restrictions with SB 9 additional units? And two, will the neighbors be formally notified? Those are just basic questions for my chit chat around here.
Yeah, I mean, the parking standard would be outlined in the objective standard, and that will happen in February sometime in the first quarter of next year.
Okay,
Yeah, and then as for the public noticing, does this get noticed like a standard project? No?
I mean, when the zoning is adopted, right, this SB 9 or amendments to the SB 9 ordinance will be duly noticed.
But once
Individual
somebody has
projects,
applied, yeah, so for an individual construction project.
So it's just like an
It will-
ADU.
Yeah, it will not be publicly noticed.
okay, thank you. That answers it. Thank you for all of your hard work.
Thank you. Do we have anyone else?
I'm sorry. There's no one with their hand raised on Zoom. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I will now close public comment and bring it back to the commission for discussion. Pat, would you like to start us off tonight?
Okay, so I have a question. So I have lots of yellow stickies here. And I think what I'm going to do is just highlight the ones that I think are important, and then I'll give you my list so you can correct it before it goes to city council to expedite. So starting on page 3.3, your figures, 3.1, 3.1A, 3.1B, you are missing like Mallard Point being highlighted there. Oh, so these are site that's already done, so it doesn't have to be there. Okay, by income, that's already done. Okay, so you're okay there. On page 3.9, you have 501 Belvedere Avenue. I don't know what property that is. It's talking about sites with existing capacity. Could that possibly be 501 San Rafael?
It is, yes. I had the same comment. It's just typo.
Okay, that was talked about. Okay, I have a question on some of the quarter ones in 2025. There's a lot. I don't know if that's a reasonable request. I want to say that when we talked about 4.6 and 4.7, that it has to include low-income housing on the deed restriction, to clarify that. There's that was done. Oh, I don't know if this is a question or a comment. On page 4.9, we have a list of providers. We have the Tiburon Fire, the Reed School District, SAN 5, that we're going to talk to about. Oh, that's not there. Okay, forget that. And then we're going to clarify 2A. And wherever, like on page 416, where we talk about multifamily housing projects, I think it should say multifamily zone housing projects, just so that it's clear that we're talking about multifamily zones versus just a multifamily development, because you can get confused on that with the SB9s. I mean, it could be a conflict between our code and our housing element. Also, after our meeting with HCD, I think it's very important that we bring emergency shelters to the Planning Commission, along with adding that verbiage of low income to our ADU section. And I think it's important enough, according to HCD, we would not be certified until we did have that in our code. So I propose that it's simple language that needs to be added. It's that it can come back at our November meeting as a special meeting just prior to our regular meeting, so that it can go to City Council in December. And hopefully then we can say to HCD when we submit it that we have this in progress, and it will be done soon after they approve us. That got taken care of. Let's see. Oh, couple more spots with low income. Again, on page in Appendix A, and two things with this R2 and R3 program 2A is that you say the height can be 28 feet, or the SB9 2E, that the height can be 28 feet. I think that height should come out and say according to the zone, since it's citywide. And in one section in the beginning, it says it's on Belvedere Island. And then in another section, it doesn't say it's on Belvedere Island. And then again, on page 831, it says Belvedere Island neighborhood. So I think that was from a prior, and it just needs to get clarified. The other question I had was, I guess this is a question. You have 29 vacant parcels. Why are you counting our parks and open spaces as vacant parcels?
They shouldn't be.
They are. So, okay, we can work on that.
Yeah.
Okay. I had no comment on B. And then we talked about that. About that. Oh, in your table C44A, there's no page number. In the notation on 11, it's talking about the height in the lagoon section of the R1L section. And it describes that it correctly, except that there's an additional requirement that it can't be over 29 feet from existing grade. And then on C13, two notations, you have some notes below the table C4B, and you don't include them in the chart. There is no numbers in the chart to reference the notes. And then in floor and lot area restrictions, it's a little confusing because I think you're talking about R15 more than, because each zone has its own requirement. So it's really hard in the city to say what can be developed, because a lot of time it has to do with height and everything, and the sizes aren't actually all correct that you have here. So you say R1 district ranges from 50 times the lot size or 3,500 square feet. And 40 to 40% or 40 to 40 square feet. So I just think those numbers are a little off.
I looked at those numbers too. I think it's a summary, and if you actually dig into the numbers and
It's a summary of
it
all the
matches,
units.
yeah, what's allowed,
Mhm.
but it's worded differently than what's in our zoning ordinance. So I kind of dug into them, but I think they track with what is permitted, but let's double check it.
Okay. C23 has that low income that we talked about. I'll go to that offline. Okay, now let me just check my notes. I think everything else I can just give you the hit list to go over. Those were kind of the highlights I wanted to bring out. So I was very worried about the 2A program until you did your slide. So you relieved my anxiety there. So it was something I wasn't going to be able to go for, but now that we've worked the final detail out and it's going to get corrected, I'm fine with it. And also working out the details on the SB9 also gives me pause that we're doing what we have to do, but doing what's best for the people. So I would be able to make the recommendations with the corrections that we've made and comments. I also want to thank the staff and you for all the hard work, and for our Mayor Peter Mark and Vice Mayor Jane Cooper, who worked diligently and tirelessly on this housing element to get to this point. And I think that we've come up with the best solutions of all the solutions that we could have come up with. So it's not easy for us to do this to our community, but we do have to follow the state law. And I think this is following the state law and makes it acceptable and somewhat tolerable for the community versus what some other options could have been. So with that, I would make the recommendation to move it on to City Council.
Great, thank you. And just before we jump into anyone else, if you have more minor comments, I think just for your sanity too, just in terms of tracking everything, can we put it in an email? Okay, and if it's been said, no need to repeat it. On that note, Alex, would you like to? Thank you.
I did spend quite a bit of time reading this, and I'm impressed with the amount of work. It seems like a very technical document, and I don't have any further comments. I would like to recommend that we forward it to the City Council for approval. Thank you.
Thank you. Kevin?
Sorry about that. Yeah, I don't have any additional comments. My questions and comments were already addressed in the earlier portion of the meeting. And again, I think this is a huge step forward. I appreciate all of the work from all of the key players that went into this. And I can support moving it forward with the updates we discussed and clarifications, and get it to City Council.
Great, thank you. So I have a couple pages of kind of minor things, which I will put in email. No need to go over that again. Couple bigger things. I think that there are certain places, and I've called it out here, where more context is, I think, relevant and important. I think we need to include something about water conditions, drought conditions in California and in the county. I think that's relevant. I think there are a couple different places where I think we could just add a little bit more color. And then we also have, I think it's in the section 2, we have a sentence in there, something to the effect of some in the community have suggested that new single-family uses could be prohibited. It's either we're doing that or we're not doing that. And I just don't think it should be in there unless we are committing to doing that. And as I understand it, we don't have any plans to eliminate single-family zoning in those zones. I'll save the rest for an email. But again, I want to just reiterate what everyone else has said and thank all of you for all the work that's gone into this. Every draft is getting us closer to getting a certified element. And I think a lot of thoughtfulness has gone into addressing HCD's comments. I think the SB9 strategy is a really good one for this community, given all the building constraints we face. And I think it's a really smart way to address that missing middle housing. And I also think that the selective and targeted rezoning makes a lot of sense. I think we want that higher density development in areas that are better served by public and private amenities and that are in walkable areas. So I think it's a very strategic approach that really balances HCD's requirements with the community well-being. So having said that, I do have ongoing concerns with how our city, and not just our city, but cities across California are going to address failing infrastructure, water shortages, ongoing climate disasters, and sustainability in coordination with our housing goals. So I really think that the success of this housing element plan is going to depend on how well we can balance growth with sustainability. So this is kind of a separate thing, but I would love for this city to explore establishing some sort of green or sustainability fund to help offset some of the environmental impacts of the new legislation. So again, something for the city to consider and think about moving forward. But again, I think a ton of work has gone into it, and I can also make the recommendation with the changes discussed tonight that it go to City Council for review. Thank you. So we don't need a motion, I think, unless there are any further questions or comments from the commission. I think we can adjourn the meeting.
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Thank you.
Meeting adjourned. Thank you.